Hey, and welcome to a new history of Old Texas. As we get ready here to go back in the field for another 3 weeks of surveys related to the battlefield of Medina, I thought I'd release this one other speech that I just did to the San Antonio Conservation Society that I felt nicely summed up where the research has brought us so far on the Battle of Medina, on the events leading up to it, and on some exciting new clues and new connections that we've made related to the evidence that we've turned up related to the battlefield. So enjoy, and I'll touch base here in a few months. Thanks. I start this story back on September 16th, 1810. This is the famous Grito de Dolores, the 16 de Septiembre, kind of recognized as Mexico's Independence Day, when a parish priest in Dolores, Dolores, Guanajuato, unleashes this cry of centuries of frustration with Spanish rule in Mexico and sets off the War of Mexican Independence. And it kind of snowballs within a week of launching this cry. This movement has swelled, and there's thousands of followers down in Guanajuato, and they've conquered the city of Celaya, and then a few weeks later they conquered the city itself of Guanajuato, and it just kind of takes on its own momentum, and eventually this army is descending toward Mexico City. Well, at the same time, or around the same time, San Antonio gets wind of this, and San Antonio too is able to kind of unleash some of its frustration at this point with a couple centuries of Spanish rule. And San Antonio had already kind of established a reputation for itself as a bit of a thorn in the side of viceregal and Spanish authorities. It was very independent, and it was very vocal about its independence, and it was very vocal too about its sense of neglect at the hands of Spanish rule, being so far removed. And of course, our famed Canary Islanders, who set up the first civil government here, developed this tradition over the first 100 years of the city's history of a really, really proactive self-government. And so every little attempt at kind of meddling from the center, from Mexico City or from Spain, starts to feel like an imposition. And so anyway, this all comes to a head in San Antonio on January 22nd, 1811, when the citizens of San Antonio, the militia of San Antonio, kind of rise up and capture. They wait for the Spanish governor to wake up that morning, and they capture him as he walks out onto the Plaza de Armas, and they put him in chains, and they send him down to Coahuila and declare themselves in alliance with Father Hidalgo's revolution. Unfortunately, Father Hidalgo's revolt starts to not go so well. News starts to trickle back. There's atrocities perpetrated. Also, the Spanish royalist forces kind of regroup and regather and start to beat back some of these revolutionary movements. Some rumors of that trickle up to San Antonio. Also should be said, too, that the revolutionary junta led by de las Casas here, Juan Bautista de las Casas, starts to overreach. They start confiscating properties. It becomes a bit of a kind of a pogrom or a purge. Pretty soon he starts even confiscating properties of some of the people that had supported him. And so just about 6 weeks after this has started, it falls apart. And so there's a counter revolt. And so it's plotted at the Zambrano house up in River Road neighborhood today with Manuel Zambrano. Zambrano himself was a very active royalist. But he even gathers around him a lot of other kind of traditional Republicans and stuff too, showing that there was kind of broad-based exhaustion with the revolt, at least at this point in 1811. But like the Delgados and the Seguins, all these people are joining with the royalists at this moment. So 6 weeks after it started, this counter-revolutionary force waits in the Plaza de Armas for de las Casas to walk out of his house. They capture him. He gets sent now down in chains to Coahuila and is actually promptly executed. An interesting thing that happens, though, is that when the Spanish governor had been sent down into Coahuila from San Antonio, he was imprisoned on a ranch in Coahuila that belonged to a man named Ignacio Elizondo. And Elizondo was a younger officer, he was a nobleman, but he was trying to feel out the politics of the revolutionary movement that was going on in Mexico at this time. And eventually Elizondo, who had initially aligned himself as a bit of a revolutionary, this is why he is housing Salcedo at his ranch, changes his mind and decides he's going to go back to the royalist side now. So he and Governor Salcedo escape, and as they escape into Coahuila, Father Hidalgo also happens to be retreating back through Coahuila. So Father Hidalgo had made it all the way to the gates of Mexico City, basically, with a huge army of 70,000 men, but something happens. It's a bit of a historical mystery. The movement loses steam, and eventually he retreats. And soon he's being pursued by royalist armies all the way back up through central Mexico, up through the highlands, Zacatecas, Querétaro, all the way up through Saltillo. And eventually, as he's marching between Saltillo and Monclova, he's ambushed. And he's ambushed by this same Spanish governor from Texas, who had just recently escaped his chains. So they ambush him at this place called Acatita de Bajan, which is between Saltillo and Monclova. Actually, the Baron de Bastrop plays a role here also as one of the royalist people that kind of traps him. So he's got a complicated history in this too. But 4 days before this happens, a mission or an expeditionary shows up, another revolutionary from the Rio Grande Valley. And this is a guy named José Bernardo Gutiérrez de Lara. And this is a fascinating character from Texas frontier history. So he's born into one of the first families of Revilla, of one of the cities of the Rio Grande Valley there. And again, it's first families is, I say that with air quotes a little bit too. This is not a prosperous settlement. I mean, these are ranchers and sustenance farmers and merchants to a lesser extent. But anyway, he's born into this family and he becomes radicalized pretty early. Him and his brothers. One of his other brothers is a priest, and they become pretty radical Republicans is the word. And so these are two terms you're going to hear here, and they don't tie to our modern usages of the words. But here, the factions that we get split up in are the Royalists and Republicans. Republicans being kind of a term for anti-royalists. This is anti-monarchical. And so they become very, very, very radical Republicans, and he becomes a bit of a propagandist, and as soon as Hidalgo raises up the revolt, he becomes a very animated supporter of this revolt. And so he goes and seeks him out. He goes and seeks him out and catches up with him there in Coahuila. And there Hidalgo kind of gives him a commission. He makes him his plenipotentiary, his ambassador to the United States. He wants to send him to the United States to go help raise money and fund and men perhaps for their cause. So he escapes. So he escapes 4 days before Hidalgo is ambushed. Hidalgo, incidentally, he was trying to get to San Antonio. He was en route to San Antonio because it was so remote, because it had such a tradition of being anti-monarchical and anti-royalist, but obviously he didn't make it. Father Hidalgo was executed soon thereafter. But Gutierrez de Lara goes on this incredible journey overland, first to New Orleans, and then on foot all the way to Washington, D.C., where he actually eventually meets with the Secretary of State. He meets with James Monroe, then briefly with President Madison. And he has a journey, he has a diary of this journal, and it's really, really remarkable because it's a bit of a mix of like an adventure tale with a bit of Alexis de Tocqueville, kind of his impressions of the young American Republic. But to give you a flavor for the kind of person he is too, like he's not just an academic or an intellectual revolutionary. I mean, he's a hands-on kind of guy and a hands-on kind of fighter. He tells rather elliptically one anecdote about how the Spanish king, monarchical forces, had got wind of what he was doing, that he was headed to D.C. as Hidalgo's ambassador, and they send agents after him to kill him. And so he writes about this in his diary, and all he says is, "I don't carry my arms to play with," which it seems to be the suggestion that he finished off these agents. So anyway, but there'll be later anecdotes from battles where some of the Anglo-American accounts will record him mistakenly as a blacksmith by trade. But it doesn't seem that he was actually trained as a blacksmith. It just seems that at some point in the battle, somebody needed some guns repaired, and he got down there with a hammer and on his hands and knees and started repairing them himself. So he's a very hands-on leader, and he's very charismatic. So even though he doesn't win really any formal support from the United States government, recall at this point, this is 1812, the United States is about to end up at war with its old imperial master. And in Louisiana, he starts building up this fascinating force. So he ends up spending a lot of time in New Orleans and a lot of time in Natchitoches. And at this time, Natchitoches, Louisiana, not to be confused with Nacogdoches, Texas, is really kind of, and most of Louisiana is still kind of a hotbed of political intrigue. I mean, it's like, what's the Humphrey Bogart movie? Casablanca. It's Casablanca, of this period. Remember, this is 1812. It was only 1803 that Louisiana had entered the United States, and it was 3 years before that where it had been a part of Spain still too. So anyway, it's this real hotbed of intrigue, and Gutierrez de Lara starts building this force, this consortium of allies. It's anchored by a bunch of Tejanos who have already had to kind of flee Texas because of Hidalgo's revolt has collapsed, and so there's already a couple hundred Tejanos that are over there conspiring and plotting, and a bunch of them with ties to names that you'll all recognize: the Navarros, Ruizes, Beramendis, Arrocha, Leal, Delgado. All these kind of families have links over here, but he also links up with a bunch of veterans of the Aaron Burr conspiracy. And without going too much into this, my eyes have kind of been opened to this by a friend, James Burnson, who's done some great work on this. That we're so used to thinking of American history in terms of North and South, particularly in the 19th century. But his contention is that really for this period, you need to think of it in terms of East and West. And what this is, it's kind of an army of American Anglo-American Westerners. And so in August of 1812, he pulls together this force that's about half Tejanos, about half Anglo-American veterans of the Burr conspiracy, and also too has a fair number of Native American allies. He's able to build alliances with and this is fascinating, the Tonkawas, the Lipan Apaches, and the Comanches. Three groups that did not get along with each other that well either. But again, it speaks something to the charisma of this guy. In August of 1812, they crossed the border. I put ERD in there, so they called themselves the Ejército Republicano del Norte, the Republican Army of the North. And again, going back to this Republican term. So they cross in August of 1812. They meet the small Spanish force that had been sent to stop them, led by Juan Manuel Zambrano, whose name I mentioned a moment ago earlier. They defeat them. Then Governor Salcedo, who has returned to San Antonio as governor of Texas, remember this was the guy who led the ambush of Hidalgo also, is now back in San Antonio, sitting in the governor's mansion, mansion in air quotes again. Salcedo leads an army now out to meet Gutierrez de Lara and the Republican Army of the North. But the Republican Army of the North goes around him. So they act like they're headed to San Antonio, and then they turn down and they head toward Goliad. And so they end up in Goliad. First, it starts out, they're laying siege. The Republican Army of the North is laying siege to this very small royalist army that's there. They defeat them. Actually, a lot of the royalists defect into the Republican Army. But then Salcedo shows up with the rest of his royalist army, and they surround the Republicans there, and it ends up in a many month-long siege. And eventually, the royalists try to attack the Republican forces there. They lose. They're defeated. And the momentum totally shifts. Suddenly, a bunch of the royalists switch sides. They come over to the Republican Army, and before you know it, within the course of about a week, it's the royalist army that's in retreat back to San Antonio. This is actually when Jose Francisco Ruiz switches sides. So before this, he may have actually switched a little bit before. There's some evidence that he was passing information beforehand to the Republican forces. But anyway, he formally switches at this point. So then the Republicans pursue Salcedo back to San Antonio. They defeat him in March of 1813 at the Battle of Rocio. They capture the governor and his top officers. They execute them in a rather controversial flair. But they establish themselves in San Antonio. Another Spanish force led by Ignacio Elizondo, remember this was the flip-flopping guy who had imprisoned Salcedo, but he's now a solid royalist. He marches up to meet the Republican army again, and he's defeated in June of 1813 at the Battle of Alazan. And so in the summer of 1813, you have this incredible picture where Texas, at least according to one account, has become the first province in the Spanish-speaking world to entirely rid itself of Spanish royalist forces. And these movements are kicking off throughout Latin America at this point. Spain is deeply destabilized by the Napoleonic Wars and the Napoleonic invasion, and Napoleon putting his brother on the throne in Spain. So anyway. But what also happens, too, is that on April 6, 1813, this Republican movement creates and publishes what is arguably the first Declaration of Independence in the Spanish-speaking world, too. This document is from the Archivo General de la Nación in Mexico City that we fished it out, or a friend went and was able to actually photograph it for us. So this is the heading here, Nos el pueblo de la provincia de Texas, we the people of the province of Texas. So they published this on April 6, 1813. It's in Spanish, and I'll translate a few pieces of these. But it's a really incredible document because, again, I think it speaks to a bit of the charisma of the leadership of this movement, the way that it's appealing to Anglo-American tradition, to continental Hispanic tradition, and the way it tries to kind of wrap it all up and really strengthen this alliance that's been built. So it starts off here, Nos el pueblo de la provincia de Texas, jurando al juez supremo, so swearing by the supreme judge of the universe the rightness of our intentions. We declare that the chains that have bound us under the domination of European Spain are forever dissolved. Una relación de las causas, so an account of the causes that have brought about the current situation, the current measure, is owed to our dignity and to the opinions of the world. This hopefully sounds a lot to you like some of the opening lines of the American Declaration of Independence. And I'd argue that's very conscientious, that they're very much very conscious, they're very informed by this. And part of the proof of this is when you go through this document, and they talk about these things, there's various appeals to this idea of derecho natural, of natural law, which this is a solidly Anglo tradition. This is the tradition of Locke and Bentham and John Stuart Mill. This is not the continental Hispanic tradition. And so, and even the phrasing of Nos el pueblo de la provincia de Texas, when you look at some of the later declarations of independence in other parts of Latin America, and even in Spain itself with the Constitution of Cádiz, the authority is always invoked as we the power of this Congress assembled. The authority is not deriving from the people. Anyway, at least that convention is a very kind of Anglo-American convention. But What I want to highlight here as well is that as they move through the document, they also start to make references to things like the derechos sagrados del hombre, the sacred rights of man. That's a continental kind of notion. You know, that's coming through there. And they'll also make various references to their Catholic tradition, to their Catholic heritage, and to these other things. And even as they get to the end of the document too, they're going to swear kind of their allegiance with these other movements that are going on in deeper into Mexico too. So they're acknowledging this other tradition, this North American tradition that they're a part of, that some of their supporters are coming from, but they're also firmly rooting themselves in this Hispanic tradition that they view as kind of their path forward. Lorenzo de Zavala, who's first vice president of Texas, writes this incredible book in 1834. He goes to the United States, does a tour of the United States, just like de Tocqueville, except he does it a year earlier, publishes his book, also in Paris, a year before de Tocqueville. My argument is it needs to replace de Tocqueville in Texas schools because it's such a better, I think, more relevant account. Rather than a French aristocrat, you've got like the guy who becomes the first vice president of Texas and is coming from the Mexican tradition. But he talks about kind of his vision or his dream of Texas, which I think is really first embodied here in 1813. This is a generation prior, which is this idea of trying to take advantage of this kind of new North American system of government, but preserving the Spanish traditions and customs. And that's kind of the ideal, is you can achieve the autonomy of this kind of new system of government while retaining continuity with this other tradition that they're a part of. Anyway, so the last part here is to give more weight to this declaration and inspire just confidence. We swear in the name of the Holy Ghost, all of us collectively and each one individually, to our fellow men in all parts of the Republic and in front of the universe, that we will defend and maintain our principles and our country with our lives and our sacred honor, is basically the idea. This is the line that it's invoking, from whatever, hasta la última extremidad, until the ultimate extremity. And unfortunately, that's exactly what will happen. August 18th, 1813. All right, here's the outline of the battle. First, what you need to know is Gutierrez de Lara has been deposed. There's been a coup against him. What happens is at some point after the Battle of Alazan, in July of 1813, another figure appears named José Álvarez de Toledo. And this guy shows up, and he's a Spanish nobleman. He's kind of glowing, he's young, he's got big medals on his chest, and he just kind of radiates something, and he really kind of impresses people. And Gutierrez de Lara's own revolutionary junta votes to basically depose him. So they depose him, he goes to Louisiana in exile, and they appoint this new guy to be the commanding general of this Republican Army of the North. So Toledo has very little confidence from some of the key officers in this army, most notably Menchaca. Miguel Menchaca is a big Gutierrez de Lara guy, does not like this guy, but some of the other important leaders too, the Anglo-American forces and others, don't really have the confidence in this guy. They march down on the morning, the days before the battle. Earlier in the morning on August 18th, they set up an ambush somewhere near the Medina River. The idea is that they know that Arredondo, who's the commander of the Spanish Royalist force, they know that he's got to come up this way, and they're going to surprise him. They're going to surprise him in the road and then just clobber him. This Republican Army of the North has never lost a battle, and they've always won by being aggressive. Arredondo is a very, very experienced general, however. He sends forward a cavalry screening force. So he has 1,830 men. He sends forward about 300 of them under Ignacio Elizondo, same guy who's been defeated, who was part of whatever. He's still back. He sends them forward under Elizondo. And one of these riders, one of the scouts amongst Elizondo's riders, rides up to within like 50 or 60 yards of this ambush line. And they're sitting there just waiting, trying not to shoot, trying not to give away their position, and somebody fires. Somebody can't hold back. Bam! 4, 5, 6 shots ring out. They've given up their position. The worst part is they didn't even hit the guy. So the guy rides off. But anyway, their position's been blown. Elizondo marches forward and kind of engages. The Republicans, who again are super aggressive, they realize that their cover's been blown, and so they march down. They march south now to try and engage with Elizondo because they think it's the main army. They think they're going to battle with the main army, and they start to defeat them. They start to beat them. The Republicans numbered more than 1,000, maybe 1,400 men or something like that. They're defeating this little 300-man cavalry force. So the 300-man cavalry force under Elizondo starts retreating, and retreats back and back and back and back. And this is where Arredondo has his own ambush set up. So Arredondo has set up his own trap somewhere. He puts his men in a V shape. He puts the cavalry or the artillery in the center, I think, and the infantry on the wings. I'm forgetting now. I may have that reversed. And sure enough, Elizondo draws the Republican army back into this trap. Remember, it is August. It is hot. There is no water between where they started and where they're following. They follow them, depending on the accounts, like 4 to 6 miles before they finally stumble into this ambush. They are thirsty. They are tired. Their cannons, they're having to drag through the sand. It is like beach sand in this area. It's called the Encinal de Medina. It's called the Encinal because encinos, oak trees, grow there. These oak trees grow there because of the sandy soil. It's the outcropping of the Carrizo sandstone, the Carrizo formation. They're just depleted, and they just stumble into this ambush. But they put up a good fight. For 2 to 4 hours, they slug it back and forth with each other. Most of the accounts seem to indicate that the Republicans were on the brink of maybe winning the battle. But then Arredondo comes up with a ruse. He has his trumpeters play the notes of victory. He has them play the victory song. And so hearing the victory song, his own soldiers are animated, and they kind of step back forward, and the Republicans just collapse. They think they've been defeated. Suddenly it's every man for himself. They start fleeing. It's just, and from there it's a running massacre back to the Medina River. So there's no quarter given. They'll kill something like 1,000 men on the field of battle over the course of the day. And unfortunately, that's not even the worst of it. You know, from there, they follow into the city of San Antonio the next day. There's something like 300 men that are holed up in San Fernando Cathedral who are unceremoniously yanked out and executed, some of them right there. First, actually, they're stuffed into a small building for the first night where 8 or 18 of them suffocate, depending on your account. And then over the next 90 days, he pulls out basically 3 a day and just executes them against the wall. So by his own account, Arredondo will kill 327 civilian men in the city. And it's even worse for the women. So the women are imprisoned in this building called La Quinta, which sits back on near where the parking garage for the Bexar County Courthouse is today, or would have sat there. They're imprisoned in there for 54 days and made to basically grind corn 20 hours a day, basically for the men who are outside executing their husbands and fathers and sons. They're fighting back this whole time, by the way, too. And so one of the ways they punish them at some point into this 54-day period is he throws the children out. Arredondo throws the children out onto the street. So like these women can hear their children crying for food, begging for food. One woman's baby dies because they throw a baby out on the street, a nursing child. The food, when the children are asking, they're screaming inside the building, like, what do we do? And the mothers are screaming, like, beg for alms. That's all you can do. So it's this terrible, terrible account. And there is an account of it, which we've translated into English and which you can find on the website or on the podcast, which we actually recorded with Joe Arciniega, for any of you guys who know him, who really did an incredible rendition of this account. But the important thing is to appreciate the trauma that this inflicts on an entire generation of Texans. This kind of thing depleted, it may have killed half of the male population, the European male population of Texas at this time, maybe more. The ones who survive flee. Some flee to live with the Indians, with the Comanches. Jose Francisco Ruiz is one of these. Others flee to Louisiana, is a common place. Not all of them make it. Some of them are caught. Arredondo sends Elizondo to go pursue them as they're retreating. But some of them do make it to Louisiana, where they set up lives in Natchitoches for the next 8 or 9 years, which will also be important years because it's going to establish a lot of the contacts that will later be the motivations and even the personal contacts that will drive a lot of Anglo-American immigration in the decade following that, when Mexico finally does achieve its independence in 1821. But even when Mexico does achieve its independence, it's deeply unsatisfying because what ultimately happens there is that the royalists, people like Arredondo, flip. They decide, you know what, we kind of like this idea of having our own country, but we want to be in charge of it, not the Republican revolutionaries that had led it before. So that's the short version of what happens in 1821. So actually Arredondo, after 1821, becomes the Mexican commandant of the region instead of the Spanish commandant of the region. So there's no real change of power structures. And so even for San Antonians who by and large participated on the Republican side of this, not all of them, we've mentioned the Perez family and the Zampranos and a few others, it's very, very, very unsatisfying. And so I like to show this because jumping forward to 1836, this is a list of the men that were in Juan Seguin's company at the Battle of San Jacinto. The ones in bold are the ones whose direct relatives fought in the Republican Army of the North. The ones who are underlined and in bold were ones who were leaders in the Republican Army of the North. So the point is, the Texas Revolution of 1835-36 is not a new event. It is a rematch from 18, especially when I tell you who was on the Royalist side back in 1813. Santa Anna was a young first lieutenant at the Battle of Medina. Urrea, Ugartechea, Filisola were all Royalists during the War of Mexican independence. So these old generational dynamics continue all the way through to 1835-36. And I argue too, and this I can't quite prove this, but when Texas goes to choose a name for its new country, it chooses the Republic of Texas. The Republic of is not a common convention in English at this time. I will. Someone did call this out on me one time. They said, what about the Republic of Vermont? That's an anachronism. That gets invented in the 1860s and 70s to describe a brief period where Vermont's allegiance or attachment to countries was unclear. But the Republic of, if you will see in the Spanish-speaking world, was the term of the day. It was the word of the day for all of these movements in Spanish Latin America, República de, because this concept of Republican versus Royalist is very, very prevalent in the Spanish-speaking world at this time. I would argue that there's some strong influence, if not a very, very conscious invocation of the memory of the Republican Army of the North in the name of the Republic of Texas itself. So, to the Battle of Medina itself, that whole story I just told you, the really sad part for me is for such an influential event that left such an impact on a generation or several generations of Texans, it kills me that we don't know where that battlefield is. There are at least 3 to 4 markers today that make mention of the Battle of Medina, but there's never really been archaeological confirmation of any of those. There's never been any kind of muskets or concentration of munitions or something like that to say that this actually is the Battle of Medina. They're based on archival suppositions, based on accounts where they think it should be. And so a couple years ago, as a part of this podcast that I have here, we started trying to pull together some of the resources and some of the work of a lot of people like Kay Hines and like a lot of others who have been working on this for a long time. We sent out mailers. We sent out thousands of mailers to people in the general vicinity of the battle, just asking, like, do you happen to know where it is? Because I do believe these things have cultural memories. And I will point this out too, that as I've gone about this now for a couple years and you collect stories from people, you do get weird concentrations of stories in certain areas that seem to be correlating with some of the stuff that we're finding as well too. We enlisted the help of again, dozens of volunteers, too many to mention. There's Fred Martinez, for some of you that might know him. I'm sure a few of you know her. There's Bob Tonoff, there's some others. So anyway, and eventually we enlisted the help too or really the Texas Historical Commission kind of enlisted our help. They turned their attention to this and they reached out to me and Kay and wanted to pull together all the work that we had done on it to put some resources toward it. And so they've been a great convener of resources for us, along with the Atascosa County Historical Commission, which every year does their annual symposium on this. And there's a handful of promising clues that have sat out there over the years. There was a body found in 1968 right here on Blue Wing Road that had an enormous lead ball in its neck. And it had buttons on it that seemed to date from the period of about 1813. And so for a long time it's been thought to be perhaps a casualty, a Republican volunteer retreating from the battle who then dies or something to that effect. And there's a few other little things that turn up, musket balls or cannonballs here and there. And there's some really tantalizing mentions about the battlefield and where it might be in the handful of archival accounts that exist out there from various periods. So there's 1815, there's somebody walking through talking about they found the field of the Battle of Medina, bones and skulls for a space of nearly an entire league. There's another mention here in, 1822, where this is a loyal ally of Gutierrez de Lara, who was not at the battle because he was in Louisiana recruiting, who was there in 1822 when they go to actually bury the bones from the Battle of Medina. And he's citing this lake 6 miles from Medina. This other one, 1828, the short distance from Rancherias, goes on, another one, a small lake, 4 to 5 distance, 6 miles from Medina. The next stream of water past the Medina, or is it past another stream of water? This is from Jose Antonio Menchaca, who is the nephew of the Tejano leader in the battle, who's recalling this place near the Charcos de Gallinas. Keeping going. This is from 1898. Somebody writing about another issue, not even writing about the Battle of Medina, but who mentions in passing Toledo's defeat by Arredondo on Gallinas Creek. And this is the one that really kills me. So Kay found this one. This is Roy Hall, right? Yeah, Roy Hall was his name, an amateur historian who was really fascinated by the battlefields of Texas and had made it his life. I think he made it his honeymoon to go to look at all these different battlefields in Texas. And so he's writing this letter to another Texas historian at this point about how he finally found the Battle of Medina. So when finally located, I could hardly believe my good fortune, for it is in the same apparent state now as when the battle was fought 119 years ago. And then he stops. He doesn't give any more clues about where that was. He just rolls right into the Battle of Rosillo. But ultimately, what really got this kicked off the ground, I would argue, was a strategic partnership with UTSA's Center for Archaeological Research, and especially with the American Veterans Archaeological Recovery Project. AVAR is interesting because it's a 501c3. They reached out to me through one of their listeners had found the podcast. They were trying to get into Texas to expand their work here. So what they're all veterans of the different uniformed services, trained in archaeology, And the idea is that it serves two purposes. Is that one, who better to analyze a battlefield than a veteran? But also two, it's meant to be a form of rehabilitative therapy almost for them. It gives veterans, a chance to return to a mission-oriented objectives in a communal setting. Whenever they go work in a field somewhere, they stay together, they bunk together. Anyway, it's a really, really positive environment. And they were looking to get into Texas. And of course, a lot of the other Texas battlefields are pretty worked over, but they liked the idea of this one. The other advantage that we have with them is that they're using all the same equipment, all the same training, and so you get a really high quality result. If you search an area with these folks, there's a lot of integrity to the results that you come up with. So we got out there on February 1st earlier this year. We searched 3 sites, about 28 acres is what we covered. There was about 12 volunteers, plus Dr. Stephen Humphrey is the CEO of the organization. You grid out the entire area, and they're in 20 meter by 20 meter blocks, and you mark off these 1.5 meter lanes with 3 meter lanes in between. And the idea is that you have these teams, and they're working with a metal detector. So they walk through these lanes, scanning back and forth. Every hit, every piece of metal that goes off, somebody drops a flag in. They drop a flag in, every flag gets dug up, every artifact gets bagged, geotagged, GPS location put on it, and looked at. In the course of 3 weeks, we must have pulled out 3,000 artifacts. We found 3,000 pieces of metal, is a better way to say that. A lot of fence nails and barbed wire and stuff like that. But on one of the sites, we started to find some really interesting stuff. So these are at least the half dime is non-battle related, but it was kind of cool. It's an 1854 Liberty half dime that has buttonholes punched through it. Some kind of interesting brass artifacts that we found in this area that we're still trying to date a little bit. We found a lot of shotgun head stamps. But it's actually non-trivial because some of these date back to the 1880s, which what it says is that our methodology, our metal detectors are finding stuff that is at least 150 years old, and actually with the dime there, back to 1854, it makes us feel comfortable that there was always some fear that maybe artifacts from the battle could have subsided over the centuries or something like that. But no, it seems pretty conclusive that we are finding stuff from the near colonial or the late colonial period out there. All right, so then some of the really exciting stuff. We did find some musket balls and some pieces of lead sprue. So what I'm not showing you on here is we found a lot of modern munitions, 22s and 45s and stuff like that. Those are pretty easy to pick out. They have a different shape. These are spherical balls, which, and in particular when accompanied by the sprue here, and I learned this from Kay and Clint McKenzie when we were out in the field, is the way the lead balls at the time of the battle would have been made is picture a set of pliers with like 2 ice cream scoops, one on each side, and they close, and there's a little hole in the top. And you pour your molten lead into that little hole, and it makes a sphere, but it's got a little cherry stem on it. So then you've got to clip that cherry stem off, and that's the sprue that you would see there. And what was really cool was we found a few musket balls that were impacted. That mean they hit something or someone. This was a big one, a 61 to 65 caliber ball, consistent with the period, which tended to use larger caliber munitions. But you can just tell by the way it's deformed, that it hit something. It may have rifling on it, which is not inconsistent with the period. There were some rifles in the period. I forget the name, but we're not certain that it's rifling, but there's interesting marks there on it. We found a couple others as well that you can see this one was just flattened. This is a smaller one, but again, consistent with some of the smaller round arms that were used at the time of the battle. And another one. But the really, really exciting one is this one. This is iron, and it's still got the stem on it. And it is consistent with grape shot of the period. So grape shot is essentially how you turn a cannon into a shotgun. So, really, really brutal tool of warfare, but the kind of thing you would use at close quarters combat. Most of this battle was fought at like 40 yards of distance from each other. And the diameter of this one in particular is consistent with some of the grape shot later found at the Battle of Resaca de Palma, some of the stuff from the beginning of the Mexican War. But again, munitions had a long life during this period. There's cannons from the Alamo from the 1700s, and so what's fascinating about this is that if you find musket balls, that's interesting. But people could have been firing musket balls for a lot of reasons. You could have been hunting, you're hunting a deer, or could have been an engagement with an Indian attack or something like that. But to find this came out of a cannon. And cannons were not fired as often through this area. And the only other round that we have in this area that also came out of a cannon was this blue wing ball. That ball, this 1.18 caliber ball that was found in the neck of this blue wing body, again, also, there's no muskets that fire rounds that big. That came out of a cannonball too. But what we did too is we took our artifacts and we sent them off to Texas State University, where they have a tool called an XRF, an X-ray fluorescence device, which what it does is it's a non-destructive way to analyze metal objects, and it can read the metallurgy from them. So it scans it with a little laser deal, and it looks like a UPC code, like think at HEB when they scan the dog food down in the bottom of your cart. It scans over it, you set it there for a few minutes, and it'll spit back to you the composition of, so each one of these numbers corresponds to an element or to some form of alloy. And you can see, there's a wide variation here all over the place. These are all the lead objects that we sent as possibly consistent with the period. But 3 of them really grouped together. 3 of them were, in fact, identical matches with each other, and they were identical matches with the Blue Wing ball, which was found in 1968. So that's really, really encouraging that we are finding some lead munitions that came from the same place as wherever that lead munition that was in the Blue Wing body's ball was created to, was either mined or smelted or something. So it's not conclusive, of course. It's a handful of artifacts. We're talking about a battle that saw 950 cannon rounds fired just by the Royalist forces, and who knows how many thousands of other munitions. We still have more work to do. So starting here in 2 weeks, actually, we're going back in the field. We're going to search another 3 sites at least, 40 plus more acres, try and expand upon where we found stuff. But also we want to search some of these other claimed sites too. We want to make sure we're not suffering from some kind of narrow-mindedness or something like that. You got to try and stay open-minded in this. And again, this is one of the great challenges of even reading through the archival records is your mind so wants to fixate on one clue or fixate on something and say, that's it, that's got to be it, that's got to be the spot. And then there's some other contradictory piece out there. So anyway, we're trying to keep our minds open to all of these things to be able to really dig in and continue our work. With that, I will conclude then just with the last remark that there's something so fitting and so perfect about, like, if it really can be, this group of veterans, and which includes people from all over the country too. I mean, we've got local volunteers, we've got volunteers from the East Coast, from the West Coast. Like, it's just too perfect, And so I think we're making positive progress on this. I think we're advancing the scholarship of the battle, but I think we're also bringing to light an important period in Texas history, in San Antonio history, that gets overshadowed too often. Thank you guys, and I'll open for questions here. So.